Salam, namaste, buenos dias, and all the other wonderful things. I'm so glad to be here with all of you. How's the sound? Everyone is good? It's good? All right. We are here today to be able to kind of get a sense of how we take our own struggles for a more just, demilitarized, and peaceful world into as we're living in the heart of empire. So that's an important clarification because we are living in the heart of empire. This morning we had a conversation about whether Saudi Arabia was, evil. And I was like, not even a fraction of the evil that we're actually living within here in terms of, what harm has been done to the rest of the world. So I think just situating ourselves in recognizing that and recognizing that we also sit, as we were told yesterday, literally on the bones and the spaces of the indigenous people whose lives were given and whose earth was given to make all this possible, and yet who have reminded us that actually that was never the way, and now we're unlearning everything that we thought was important about how to build a future. So it gives me huge pleasure to introduce this amazing panel to talk this morning to us. And I just want to say, apropos of the comments this morning, there is an encampment on the Denver campus, but they've done a collective one because they have many campuses. And thanks to my colleague and sister Terry, who asked that question. So the team here from University of Denver can tell us, and if people want to be able to go and stand in solidarity and spend some time there, at some point later today, we can actually do that. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that it isn't like the students aren't making trouble here, they are. So with that, let me say that you will have in your background the information about these amazing people, but starting from my immediate left, Lara, welcome. It's so wonderful to have Lara Kiswani, who is a Palestinian activist, and I am now switching between, my background on all of these amazing human beings. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on each of them. They're not exactly in the order that I had it in, but Lara has worked as a youth and adult educator, is a lecturer at San Francisco State University, and is a board member of Critical Resistance and executive director of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. We're so grateful for you being here. Give it up for Lara. Sara is to her left. I'm left, right? Yeah, left. I'm left-handed. I'm always to the left. Always to the left. Sara is with Win Without War and leads day-to-day operations, development, and organization strategy. She previously worked at the Mozilla Foundation, Change.org, and Get Up Australia, and brings a very unique voice to a discussion around foreign policy discourse. She's also had way too much time, I think, in the halls of power in Washington, but we're here to make her, recover from that. So I'm grateful. Of course, Miss Christine Ahn, as you all know, that was like a really crazy introduction. Don't believe any of that. But she is the founder and executive director of Women Cross the DMZ, a movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War, the longest ongoing war that this country has been involved with, and also the one that's the most invisibilized, and has been a huge leader in peace building. She's had an incredible impact on so many people in so many different spaces, including the ones who think that peace has to do with just ending the dropping of bombs. And I think I've learned so much from Christine, also about grassroots organizing and making sure that actually you can take people to places. The work that she did to take 30 international women peacemakers across the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas was really amazing, and then helped launch the Korea Peace Now campaign in 2019. There's many other things I could tell you about all of these amazing women, but I'm not going to do that right now. And then lastly, but definitely not leastly, Sandy, now, who is the director of Justice is Global, a grassroots movement that mobilizes everyday people for structural change in the global economy. As we heard yesterday from our amazing panelists, there's no way we can do this work if we're not actually trying to change the fundamentals of the economic structure that perpetuates and makes actually necessary the kind of militarization that we're seeing in the globe right now. She develops Justice Global's organizational strategy, and particularly harnessing the strength of new immigrant and diasporic communities to advance a progressive internationalist agenda. So our conversation here today is, as we were talking about it on Zoom, and now I get to meet them all in person, was really talking about, these words, feminist foreign policy, that we've been hearing and that are kind of, as we, again, our amazing speakers yesterday talked to us about how that in itself has become code and has somehow become a kind of pink washing. I've decided that it's essentially imperialism in pink tutus. What would actually be different if it was the kind of intersectional, international, transnational, as Margot said yesterday, kind of just feminist policy that we would actually dream of, that utopic vision that we would dream of? And what I'm hoping is that each of you will speak to the wisdom that you bring from the particular places that you sit in. And so we're going to start with a question to each of you about this particular moment that we're in, how you see it, how you analyze it, what is the sharp focus that you bring from where you sit so that we can understand that. But I hope that you will also engage with each other. And I want to say to the audience, we know that it's hard to sit and not be able to engage, and we're going to try our best because these amazing women will say what they're going to say anyway. So we will make sure that we try and leave enough time for you all to engage with us at the end. So without further ado, Lara, you're sitting here in front of me, closest.
We self-organize.
You self-organize, even better. The moderator doesn't have any work to do. Sandy is going to start. Mashallah, mashallah. Thank you.
Yeah, well.
Sandy, hukum.
Does this work?
It works.
Okay, all right. So really glad to be here with everyone this morning. Again, my name is Sandy and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of Justice Global. Justice Global have been, in the past few years, been mobilizing, organizing ordinary people around a progressive approach to US-China great power conflict. And the vision that we have come up with is deeply rooted in some of these values that feminist peace work have been always upholding, including solidarity, interdependence of communities across borders, as well as collective care, and so on. So just, to the question of where I'm sitting in terms of analyzing this moment, US-China great power conflict, everyone has to understand, has really deep roots in the failures of new liberalism that has for decades failed to deliver broad prosperity and material benefits to people everywhere. Instead, it has concentrated wealth in the hands of very few, privileged few in the global north. So because of that, the inequalities and dislocation that new liberalism has left behind has been politicized to animate these discontents, anxieties, and fear that we see in a lot of people's, especially working class white Americans, who find an outlet in terms of what their version of the solution to peace and security is zero-sum competition between racial, ethnic groups, as well as between communities across borders. So yeah, that is kind of the baseline that I want to set up here. So knowing that, unfortunately, I have to be the deliverer of bad news because of some of these, high-level exchanges that we see in the past few months between U.S. and China, including, Janet Yellen's visit and Blinken's visit, so on, does not really address the fundamentals or the underlying forces that are in place that set these two countries on a collision course. So that is kind of the unfortunate news. So I just want to say a little bit more about some of these underlying features and structural pressures that, that are in place. So on the US side, we know that there is this bipartisan consensus of seeing China as an existential threat to US primacy as well as US-led international rules-based international order, right?
So great rules.
Great rules, indeed. Exactly. So as we know, for the mega Republicans and today, I would say probably the entire Republican Party, really China is part of their path to power. We know this because there was a memo that was circulated by the Republican Study Committee in 2021, and it specifically said that Donald Trump brought a gift to the Republican Party for becoming the party of the American working class, and that China is the corollary of Republican Party's support for American working class people. So that is on the Republican side. And on the Democratic side, of course, we know there is this visible fear of being or coming off as soft on China in a lot of contested races in electoral and political context. But beyond that, I think a lot of it, the way that the Biden administration and mainstream Democratic Party has approached China is what I define as opportunistic. Because, on the policy level, the Biden administration really diagnosed the problem well. They implemented these, broad industrial policy measures like Inflation Reduction Act, investment in American workers and infrastructure to really address some of these underlying causes for rising authoritarianism. However, they bet their political strategy, which is animating China as this foreign threat so as to rally Americans around to sustain a political coalition for the administration's economic project. And in our view, this is going to backfire in a very disastrous way because some of these exclusionary measures that the Biden administration has proposed, has enacted, is inevitably going to be perceived as highly threatening to China's economic interests, thus really continue this escalated spiral. And at the same time, at the micro level, there was also some polling that we know from 2020 that was conducted by Annette Schenker-Osorio's team that suggests that the peddling of anti-China rhetoric, pandering to nationalist sentiments by Democratic Party candidates is eventually going to push voters even further to the right? Peddling your opponent's solution is going to push voters even closer to your opponents. So this is what I said, some of these underlying forces and pressures are in place on the US side. And on Chinese side, we know from these headlines that China is in deep economic trouble right now. The urban youth unemployment rate is at record high. It's so high that the Chinese government has stopped publishing it. And we also know the real estate sector just went bust. So we have to understand, against this economic wolves, the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy largely depends on generating high economic growth. And this was an implicit compromise that the party made with Chinese people after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. A high economic growth in exchange for people's reticence with an oppressive regime. So against this context, as I said, whatever U.S. do in terms of excluding, isolating China and punishing, imposing these restrictive measures on these many things will be perceived by the Chinese side as potentially threatening. And also, as I said, just really quickly wrapping up, just similar to what the U.S. politicians doing in terms of pandering to the worst and nationalist sentiments here, the Chinese government is doing the exact same thing. And they are pointing fingers in front of Chinese people saying that this US is your number one enemy. And this has always been the case that they have been using U.S. and also other Western countries to discredit internal discontents, political, oppressing these popular political dissenting movements and so on. So yeah, I'm sorry that I'm kind of the bearer of the bad news, given that there are these exchanges that we see. But what I want to warn is that there is this growing complacency among U.S. foreign policy leaders that see in these high-level exchanges as a way around it. They don't have to pay attention to the underlying root causes. So what we see is right now the U.S. is really rallying in its ally to isolate China, and China is doing basically the same thing, discrediting U.S. conduct in the global
Sandy,
South.
speaking as a representative of one of the countries the U.S. is trying to hone in on their side to be a force against China, I will take use of my hegemonic power as moderator and ask you to move to since you've self-organized, to the next speaker. I just wanted to say what we're trying to do here is to try and also frame a way in which, when you sit as somebody who represents a diaspora, the ways in which you think about your connections to these set of problems, and the ways you think about the place that you're from and the way that part of the world looks at these sets of connections is really important for us, because we often think about foreign policy as something that is just from the center, which of course is the global north as they think of themselves, to the periphery. And instead, actually, what is important here is to understand that anyone who represents a diasporic view is constantly shuttling between those two perspectives and can actually understand this power dynamic in the way that Sandy just played out, which is, it's not just how the US sees China, but it's also how China is seeing the US. And then in the middle of that, how the people of both countries are experiencing their relationship to each other. With that, the next on our list, is that you, Christine? Is that Lara?
Okay. Is it me? Oh. Okay. I'm
That's
really
so
organized.
Self-organizing. I wasn't quite sure how you had self-organized.
Sure.
So I was...
Well, I mean, first I have to just speak to the rage that I think we're all feeling at this moment, not just for the complete failure of the Biden administration to stop the genocide that is being waged on Palestinian lives, using our taxpayer dollars and US weapons, but renewing just last week, $95 billion more in military aid to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, on top of the $1 trillion that it has already given to the Pentagon to fight more wars and militarism and violence and forever military occupations on 800 US bases around the world. So I think just starting there. But from my corner of the world, Korea, and thank you, Kavita, for recognizing the invisibilized longest US war. I'm deeply disturbed by the administration's failure to restart talks. Yes, the clown Trump and his, really what he did was set back Korea so further back. He wasted this huge opportunity that actually the two Koreas set the table to negotiate a permanent settlement to the war. And the Biden administration has done nothing, really. As someone who engages with both senior officials in the Biden administration and actually the North Korean mission at the UN, I'm just baffled by the inability of the Biden administration to align the right hand with the left hand. I mean, they are so slick. They say all the time, they're ready to talk anywhere, anytime, no conditions to North Korea. And the North Koreans have repeatedly said, we won't engage with you. Why should we engage with you after we went through that whole process and you just walked away, you shamed us, and you are conducting aggressive military exercises that includes decapitation strikes. That is regime change. More sanctions. This is sanctions that bar fuel from being imported to North Korea so that farmers can run their tractors, so that the North Korean people can heat their homes. This includes medicines. This includes like this guy, Dr. Key Park, who is a neurosurgeon from Harvard. I mean, he has gone to North Korea. He hasn't been since the pandemic, but he would go and conduct surgery alongside North Korean doctors and nurses. And he would ask for the gauze, and they would be reused. They would have to clean them. They were browned. And then he would ask for a scalpel, and it would be dull because...
Christine, I'm just acknowledging here for a second that when you said the word gauze, I think we've all learned where that word came from. It came from Gaza. The word gauze is a very fine fabric that was actually first developed and created in ancient space called Gaza, and that's where the word gauze comes from. It's just a moment for us to understand that there's places that don't have gauze, and the people who gave us gauze don't have it either.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but they, you know, the scalpels are rusty because the North Koreans are banned from importing metal. I mean, that is the insanity of it. And the Security Council resolutions that the Trump administration passed prevents North Koreans from exporting textiles, from exporting seafood. I mean, who works in those textile factories? Like overnight, 200,000 North Korean women lost their jobs. I mean, this is the insanity. And Trump instituted a ban on Americans from traveling to North Korea in 2017. You can go anywhere in the world except to North Korea. That is so absolutely nuts. And that was because the action of one American male who was drunk, who misbehaved badly, and I'm not condoning what the North Koreans did, that they responded in a bad way as well too. But to then have a policy that prevents over 1,000 Americans, mostly Korean Americans, from finding their families to go to their families' hometowns, like that is absolutely nuts. So I am enraged. And instead of recognizing how dangerous it is that the US has no communication with the North Koreans at a time when both sides are engaging in aggressive military testing, missile testing, exercises. The US is forcing South Korea into a trilateral military alliance with Japan because of China. You know, this, and just to bring back the history, I mean, I think about my parents who have passed, but they were born in the 1920s under a colonized Korea, under Japanese occupation. They couldn't speak Korean. They had to take Japanese names. There were no Korean language newspapers allowed in Korea. And so for now, you can imagine, even a lot of the war crimes that took place in that period, the comfort women, the forced laborers, there have been no justice for these populations of Koreans, and for the Yoon administration in South Korea right now to just look past that so that they could further the trilateral military alliance to enable US hegemony in the region is just insane to me. And so this is the state of US policy on Korea, and it's a military first doctrine, and unless we can move to a peace first one, we will not achieve the so-called stated goals of denuclearization, improved human rights, or peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Lara, are you going to end or are you going to go first, Sara?
I'm going next.
You're going next.
Yes.
Thank you.
I just learned that.
All right. Excellent.
Is this on? Well, thank you all for having me here, and for the stewards of this land for allowing us to be here.
I'm not sure that did
it's
you
not
switch
on.
it on? It's on? Okay.
Speak louder. Is that better?
Yeah.
okay.
There we go.
I want to first start with the question about where are we positioned in this moment? As a Palestinian daughter of refugees, we are in a moment where my father, who we consider the generation of al-Nakba, those who lived through the creation of the state of Israel and the subsequent dispossession and colonization of Palestine. He is now 86 years old, witnessing another Nakba. And my father is dying. And as we hold this moment of grief for our people and our collective humanity, we're also in a moment knowing that while the Nakba generation is passing away, we are creating a new Nakba generation for Palestinians. I start there because we can't really make this brighter than it is, but our story is never just one of defeat. As an organizer, it's always important that we ground ourselves also in this political climate and what's made possible. So as Palestinians, literally, I'm gonna answer the question literally, where we find ourselves in diasporas, we find ourselves in the streets, we find ourselves in the halls of power, we find ourselves in the courts, we find ourselves mobilizing for our comrades for jail support, we find ourselves educating our colleagues, we find ourselves raising our children, and we find ourselves fighting for justice.
Yeah.
And we are living in a moment of unprecedented violence for our people. As we all pivot to focus on doing everything in our power inside the belly of the beast to stop this genocide, we are all also simultaneously mourning the many Palestinians we have lost and honoring all the relatives who have fought tirelessly on the front lines in Gaza, in 1948 Palestine, across the West Bank, and in diaspora. These past 7 months and counting have put all of our collective energies to the test. The Palestinians and our allies have joined millions across the world, the majority of the world, each and every day to show up and do everything we can to disrupt business as usual.
Yeah.
All the while, we are doing so knowing that the repression against us is intensifying, and we see that on college campuses right before our eyes. That the fascism of Zionism is wielding its violence locally and globally. And the moment we are in today also requires us to fight, but also think strategically. So we've been working tirelessly to get creative, to think about how we as a movement can be in strategic coordination, how to sharpen our demands. We went from demanding an immediate and permanent ceasefire, which we would have never thought. Here we are in May still demanding an immediate and permanent ceasefire. But we're also demanding divestment. We're also demanding stop arming Israel, stop all US aid to Israel. We know who the targets are. We know as strategists, as organizers, who the decision makers are on this issue. We know who has the power to enforce a ceasefire, who has this power to stop arming this genocide. Yet we can't seem to crack the formula to get those demands met. Fundamentally, we know this war is about US foreign policy. Fundamentally, we know the Israeli genocide is a US war.
Here.
We are witnessing in Palestine today is part of a 75-year struggle against this colonial violence, 16 years, 17 years of this brutal, inhumane siege on Gaza, the longest siege in modern history, backed by and made possible by the economic, military, and political power of support of the United States government. So as Palestinians, we understand our movement is part of this global movement against settler colonialism. In particular, as Palestinians living in the United States, we understand our struggle is also a land-back struggle alongside our indigenous siblings. We understand the struggle against Israeli apartheid as a struggle against ethno-supremacy, white supremacy, religious supremacy, fascism, and right-wing authoritarianism. Terms that are used commonly here in the US, but not often used to be applied to the Israeli apartheid regime.
That's right.
Today, it is a struggle against the most right-wing fascist government in the Israeli history.
Yep.
So where we're situated today, not only as Palestinians, but I'm going to speak now as a collective body of people of conscience, is as Maryam Barghouti states, Palestine is offering the world a moment of sobriety to the false democracies they live in, to the tyranny that was hidden is now out in the open. So we collectively are in a moment of decisiveness. We are either choosing genocide or we are choosing justice. We are either choosing fascism or we are choosing radical democracy. And I'm hopeful that this conversation and the work we're collectively doing today will help us to sharpen what that means and also get us all into that story where we are protagonists in this moment fighting for something different.
Woo! Thank you, Lara. Sara, you got to go next because, you know, if enemy number one, speaking of diasporas, is China today, the enemy that has continued to be the enemy through all kinds of versions and faces and eras of this country is the great, terrifying Republic of Iran, you know, which clearly is the epitome of all evil on this earth. So
What can I say?
go for it, diaspora.
So life lessons, don't go after you. I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'm also a novelist, and I've been going back into creativity and storytelling. And to the point of like, yes, Iran and its things, I'll share part of the story of my family. So I'm also married to a Jewish Russian man. We have a lot of fun going through checkpoints together.
Feminist foreign policy starts at home, y'all.
I mean, like, yeah.
I know that well. I'm married to a Pakistani Muslim.
I mean, you know, we go through checkpoints together and they're like, where were you born? And it's like Tehran and Moscow. And you see the fear coming down. And like, as like an Iranian Muslim woman in this moment, there is so much grief and rage, right? So my story was one of my very first protests was against the invasion of Iraq, which I think many of you were probably at those protests as well. And I remember going to school during that period. And my nickname at college was terrorist because kids thought that was funny.
Yeah.
That was funny. And especially when you see what is happening on campuses now and what is happening on campus now, and this narrative of students needing to be safe, and of course, students needing to be safe. And I remember when I was going to college at Sydney University, when there was people who came to campus who would draw swastikas on the walls and leave severed pig heads in the Muslim prayer rooms. And the connection there was so clear that they hated both of us.
Yes.
And the story that isn't being told of the solidarity that is being shown in this moment is one that needs to be pushed back against. And again, bringing this back to my own family, my kids have Jewish and Muslim heritage, and we're raising them in both traditions to the eternal frustration of both sets of grandparents. But their very existence shows that you can overcome, right? The fact that they exist means that there's been so much more times where the people of different faiths in that region have actually lived together and thrived. And when it has broken down, it has been a political choice.
Yes.
It has never been something that is innate, right? And that is the story of this moment that we need to push back against. And within that, again, when you talk about Iran, the grief and the rage comes from, when I think about where my feminism comes from, growing up in Australia, whenever I said to anyone, I'm an Iranian Muslim feminist, they'd be like, oh, it's just because like all of the terrible repression in Iran. And it's like, yes, there is really horrific repression in Iran. But my feminism came from watching my aunties speak to men holding AK-15s and telling them that they would wear whatever they wanted and it was fine. One of my earliest moments when like other political action was we had compulsory Friday prayers in school, and an Ayatollah would come and lead them. And because I had seen so many women around me model that form of resistance, and when I was trying to avoid it and he called me out, I asked him where a female Ayatollah was. And that's where my feminism came from. And for such a long time, people didn't understand that the feminism brought in those countries isn't just about what you see in terms of the repression.
Correct.
It is the resistance.
Correct.
It is the story
Correct.
of the resistance. And it was so phenomenal to finally see the world see that over the last few years when you saw like the viral clips of women like pulling their heads up and marching into fire. And that is where my feminism comes from.
Yeah.
And the grief that comes from that is like those moments are so tokenized, right? Like there is so much solidarity in when they're happening.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to making a decision about like lifting sanctions that could make their life even a little bit easier, it's like we forget they exist.
Yep.
And Iran is then only the Iranian government.
That's right.
Right? So for me, it's you cannot normalize collective punishment while celebrating resistance. You cannot do that. And like the amount of times I am in rooms and the offhand casual racism around like, well, why don't Iranians understand democracy? And it's like, people in Iran have been pushing for democracy for longer than I have been breathing. And second of all, I tend to remember that there was a time where people in Iran elected a president. He nationalized our oil supplies, and I'm pretty sure the CIA was the one who removed him. So do not lecture me about us not understanding democracy.
The first 9/11, 1953.
Yep.
1953. Exactly. So the thing I want us to remember in this moment is the history of what has brought us here. And for all the grief and all the rage around why are we still making these arguments? Why do we still have to push for weapons not to go to people committing human rights abuses and incredible acts of violence? But what I will say is that we are stronger for what has come before.
Yeah.
And the legacy of what happened in the pushback to Vietnam, to Iraq, to all of that has actually made some of these conversations happen faster. Are they going to the speed that we want them to? Absolutely not. But I am not going to let anyone take away what the people before us achieved, because sitting with that power is the thing we need to win.
Thank you so much, Sara. So I think you've laid out pretty clearly from four very different perspectives, from very different parts of the world that have been affected, are being affected, and are currently part of what yesterday's panel so correctly identified as the constant need for a militarized capitalist state to have enemies, right? It is simply not possible for this kind of economic power to grow and for it to be enforced through military means without actually having, constant stream of enemies that we have to defend against. So I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about how you see what needs to actually change in current policy, and are there places where you feel there are particular, each of you mentioned in different ways, particular pressure points that you felt you could, push on. Could you speak a little bit more to what actually has to change and where you see potential for that kind of thing to happen? And then just in the interest of time, I'm combining two of our questions. In the notion of how this connects to domestic, because I think what is interesting is, again, the othering of the foreign, right? So when you say feminist foreign policy, there are a whole bunch of feminist activists who I've worked with in the US who are like, we really don't have time to be able to focus on foreign. There's so many problems in the United States. We just really, there is this, there is homelessness, there is violence, we can't actually be in coalition with you about this. So if you wouldn't mind also speaking a little bit to the ways in which, from what you have learned, you build this strengthened understanding of what also has to change inside for it to be able to make change outside. And Lara, let me start with you, since you're this way and you're in the current moment where, as you said, people are on the streets. And actually, interestingly, we're at a moment which I think is shaking empire. They're really uncomfortable right now. There is a moment. And this morning, I just saw Tom Cotton said there are hundreds of Gazas are springing up all over the United States. And I thought, oh, interesting. Will you now ask your ally to come and bomb all of those as well? So what needs to change inside, and where do you see the possibilities of really shifting US foreign policy? And if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, and just to respond directly to that about Cotton saying there's hundreds of Gazas. We wish there were hundreds of Gazas. If we had 1% of the strength, steadfastness, courage, and bravery of the people of Gaza, we could come a lot further in this country.
Here.
In terms of what needs to change, US empire needs to end. And we see the US-Israeli partnership as a place for us to exert energy, to chip away at US imperialism. So the unequivocal US support of Israel must stop, must be put to an end. And chipping away at that Israeli-US partnership really does contribute to the broader struggle against global militarism and US imperialism.
Absolutely.
As was stated yesterday, at the end of the day, nobody willingly gives up their land and resources. That's why racial capitalism requires war making. And Israel now is one of the world's most powerful militaries in the world. That often gets lost in the story. A nuclear power, one of the most powerful militaries in the entire world, backed by the most powerful military in the world, our government. So to change that, we need governing power. And fundamentally, and I know we say that and that can be a loaded term, but let's unpack that for a second, right? Because fundamentally for us as Palestinians, it's never just about Palestine. When we see Zionists attack public education, when we see Zionists show up in every single social justice progressive circle, then we know it's not just about Palestine, right? The same people, are trying to attack congressional leaders who fight for Palestine are attacking the congressional leaders who fight for Medicare for all, right?
Yeah.
So it's about what Palestinian liberation represents. It's about what Palestinian liberation makes possible. It's about the ongoing anti-colonial struggles against racial capitalism, against global militarism, and it's about the liberatory potential of our movements. That's what this struggle is about. So we need to defeat fascism. But when I say we need to defeat fascism, we're not just talking about Trump.
Yeah.
We need to defeat fascism in Israel. We need to put an end to the apartheid regime of Israel. We need to defeat what's happening here in this country across college campuses, because if that's not fascism, I'm not sure what is. And we need governing power in order to do so. So the power for us to govern not only would allow us to impact foreign policy, but also domestic policy.
Correct.
Because they're in a dialectical relationship. It's not as if what happens here is not connected to what happens there. And our adversaries know that. That's why there is no here and there for them, right? And we have to be able to set the economic and political priorities of our local municipalities all the way up to the government. And we have a duty to do so in this country, given the role of the United States government in Global South and across the world. So,
do you mean by that, Lara, doing more for our communities to be engaged in political process?
yes. And I'll give a small example in the Bay Area. There's been long-standing grassroots organizing and movement building that's gotten us some really solid progressive electeds in power. What does that result in? Yeah, often we often as leftists speak about the limitations of such a thing, which clearly they are. There is no such thing as governing power without a movement, right? But when you have people, our people in office in local municipalities who represent the needs, the material needs of working class communities, that's when you get the city of Hayward to divest from Israel. That's when you get Richmond, California to divest from Israel. The first two cities in the entire country to do so. That doesn't happen by happenstance. It doesn't happen because everyone's paying attention to Palestine now and it's a sexy topic. No. It happens because people did the grassroots organizing to build governing power. And the whole reason why imperialism is so developed and entrenched is because state violence has made it so it systematically deprioritizes governing power of people, of working people. It creates a crisis for the left where we have no alternative and we're not able to overcome this and we're not able to build power and shift these conditions. So using a radical feminist framework, which is inherently internationalist, right? I think we would all know that because of the nature of patriarchal and imperial violence. Those who are touched by this issue and surrounded by this violence, it's our resistance that creates a counter to blossom, right? In this case, a counter to US imperialism, global militarism, and fascism. And through the struggle against this genocide and against the US arming of Israel and against the apartheid Israeli regime, we are also creating a vision for an abolitionist future of what else could be prioritized, both here and globally. That resistance to the violence creates a vision that is born through practice, not just theory and talk, right? Practice of resistance that has the potential to really set us forth on a new course, a new path where we redistribute political and economic priorities and social relationships. And that is the context, I think, from which this struggle arises, of what's made possible. And the struggle,
I'm just in the interest of time, I'm gonna ask for a second because I wanna hold you on this point, to ask each of our other panelists to respond, because I think it'd be really interesting to know the degree to which we, as diasporic movements from different diasporas, understand how we use this. So you spoke about sanctions, Christine. You spoke about sanctions. We have had the experience of saying, oh, we're going to raise tariffs on Chinese goods. Could you, for a second, just before we lose this conversation, respond to the point Lara is making here? Do we have an opportunity to be really seeing this moment as a place that actually cracks open a space for building diasporic understanding of how we actually mobilize for something more radical in terms of this question about impacting foreign policy? Would you like to say something about that, Sandy? And then I'll come to each of you. Sorry, Lara, to interrupt.
No,
I just didn't want
helpful.
you to lose this.
So I want to.
They can hear you. You don't need to hold
right.
it. It's
Okay.
great. Yeah, you're good.
All right. So I want to make 2 points. One is sanctions and tariffs and so on. This I feel like there is this very deep political culture in this country that's seeing punitive measures as the only way to correct wrongdoings, and this is the case this is the case with China. You know, there are a lot of people. You know, we know. Chinese government has really terrible human rights violations, you know, in terms of cracking down pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, as well as, internment camps against Uyghur minorities in Xinjiang. But of course, in this larger punitive framework in this country, most people say, oh, that means that we have to punish China for whatever it's doing, right? But essentially, I think a lot of people in that circumstances are using China's human rights violation to advocate for more weapons, more militarized measures against China that's inevitably is going to escalate the tension. Whereas, not really addressing the underlying root causes. So I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding or neglect of that fact that international conflict really breeds authoritarianism under which human rights violations and crackdowns happen. So I think that is one thing that we as diaspora community have been saying for a long time. And I think this is kind of related to all the speakers, kind of a feeling in terms of grief and rage. I would say sometimes I also find it frustrated with some of our people in our own movement, the fact that we as diaspora are being used as, tokenized to kind of justify US foreign policy, in the sense that in the liberal context, we've been used as, the face of victimized, oppressive regime overseas to essentialize the dichotomy between autocracy and democracy. And in the leftist space, we are used again as pawns to kind of appeal to the taste for anti-militarism and anti-US hegemony. I mean very specifically the taste, because I don't really think that these people actually care about democracy or human rights for that matter if they can't hold the fact that both the truth in terms of we can oppose US militarism at the same time opposing oppressive regime overseas. So I think that is, to me, deeply frustrating to kind of being tokenized and used in the matter in a way that really minimize my voice and my stakes in this fight. Yeah.
Thank you. Christine, do you want to add anything to this conversation right now? I think Lara put some.
Yeah, I mean, basically what both Lara and Sandy have said. And I guess just to maybe even take it a notch deeper, I think the diaspora movements in this country is the new face of the anti-war movement. I think it is about feminist principles of care, cooperation, but also centering those that have been most impacted. And we can tell the stories of our families who have been impacted by forever US militarism and war. I mean, for the Korean diaspora, the United States, 2 defense officials in 1945, after Korea was colonized for 35 years by Japan, tore a page from the National Geographic and drew a line across the 38th parallel. And that's how Korea was divided. You can imagine the ancient nation of Korea to be just brutalized that way, and then which paved the way for a brutal war. And, Samuel Moyn, who's a historian at Yale, says, I don't mean to be about oppression Olympics, but Korea, the Korean War, it's called the forgotten war in this country. Thank you, my little pocket thing didn't really suffice. She had to bring me the mama box. It was the war that was the most brutal war in contemporary history. 4 million people killed in 3 years. 4 million people, mostly Koreans, mostly civilians. 80% of North Korean cities just carpet bombed to bits, So you think North Korea, they're going to hold on to those nuclear weapons until there is peace. So the Korean diaspora plays an important role, not just to tell about the brutality that the North Koreans experience under US imperialism, but also in South Korea. The US has backed dictators in South Korea for
years.
generations.
Decades, yeah.
And it was, it was President Carter, I hate to say, who called on the paramilitary from the DMZ to go and quash the democratic uprising in Gwangju, where the people actually took arms to say, we are fighting this authoritarian state. We are fighting this totalitarian, and it was the US, the so-called defenders of democracy. And so I think the diaspora plays a really important role in complicating the US propaganda narrative that says all this militarization is for the defense of democracy. When we say, actually, no, that is not the truth, and let's complicate this narrative. The other thing I think we have to say is we are also impacted by hawkish policies. We know what happened when Trump called the COVID pandemic the Wuhan flu and the Kung flu virus. I mean, it's not because of racism in this country. The anti-Asian violence isn't just targeted at Chinese people. Racist people don't say, hey, are you Chinese? They'll go after everybody. Anybody that looks Asian is considered a chink or Chinese. And as my Muslim sisters and Arab sisters know, it's just like we've had more than 20 years of Islamophobia. And so the red baiting, the racism, it impacts us. It tears our families apart. And that is the consequence of US imperialism and violence.
Thank you, Christine.
I want to bring in that we feel things deeply, and we also have the power to mobilize together across our silos. And I think that's what we're on the cusp of.
Sara, thank you, Christine. I think I will say that what complicates this for us in diaspora, speaking as somebody who's part of a diaspora that right now is on, in most cases, the complete wrong side, very much on the side of fascism, I will say that diasporas are complicated. Yeah. It ain't that simple. Yeah. And when we come to empire, when we come to be in the heart of empire, we want nothing more than to fit in. We want nothing more than to be whiter than white. We know on which side the supremacy is. We are not dying to be identified with Native American people or with Black people in this country, let me tell you. We come here and the first thing we start to do is be like, we're not like them. We're the good minority. We're the model minority. We know how to study. We know how to get into school. We know how to keep our heads down. We know how to not make trouble. So I'm going to ask Sara to speak a little bit to the fact that diasporas ain't that simple. We ain't that progressive. We sure as hell haven't been revolutionary for a hella long time in lots of different places. So let's talk a little bit about what it's actually going to take for us to be in a moment where Black liberation struggles have consistently, clearly, and unequivocally called on us to stand in solidarity with them. Where the fuck have we been? Sorry, excuse my French. We have not been there. We have not been there with them. We have not seen their struggles as our struggles. The white feminist movement has had nothing to do with Latino struggles for how long? Have they stood with Cesar Chavez? Did they stand with the farm workers? So yes, diaspora has potential, but what is it going to take for our movements to radicalize the potential that our diasporas have? Because honestly, part of the reason they don't stand, the people in this country who are working class people don't stand around issues of foreign policy is because where have we been on domestic policy? Where have we been on revolutionary domestic policy? So I would like to hear a little bit more about that, because I think we can get carried away with what is happening right now. And you are right, we are all Palestinians, but it has taken a long time for us to realize that we are also all Black, that we are also all Chicano or Latina, that there have been wars being fought in this backyard of the United States called Latin America and Central America for decades, And I think that is something we have to really be able to kind of put on the table and look at squarely ourselves. So sorry, Sara, to leave you with that, but I think, I think, it is important for us to recognize this at this moment. So, and then please, I'll come back to you.
So 2 things. I think, yes, it is really crucial to recognize that diasporas have politics. The idea that we're not a monolith is really important. And I see you in terms of like the diasporas being in the wrong side, like my own diaspora right now. It is horrifying to see people who are supposedly against authoritarianism in Iran, but very happy to cheer on Israel in this moment. And I have been in many conversations where I've had folks who are outside of the community throw their hands up and be like, diasporas are too hard, I just can't do it. And the way I challenge them is think about like if there was an American diaspora, if under Trump, a bunch of us were in exile in Canada and the only person that was platformed was John Bolton. And how would you feel? Because that's what we're doing when we are platforming Iranian diaspora members who have that kind of politics, right? There was an event at Georgetown University where Pahlavi spoke. Pahlavi is the son of the Shah. He is the presumptive monarch that would go to Iran. He was described as an advocate for secular democracy in Iran.
MashaAllah. Wonderful.
What are we doing here? So like, or if you have
Because we really need a monarch to
Because
give us
the
democracy.
thing Iran needs right now is a return of monarchy. So what I would say is it's not just about being a part of diaspora, it's about the political analysis around who we are and what we see as change. If you cannot see your liberation tied up with what is happening in Palestine, if you cannot see your liberation tied up with what has happened in this country, again, around anti-Blackness, then you should not be being platformed by progressive allies in this moment, and there is no excuse for when that happens. And I think that as members of the diaspora who do have those values, it is also really important for us to model the behavior of when we have power, acknowledging the harm. So for me, working with Afghan diasporas, it is not just important to continue working towards like, how do we get reparations and justice for the US war in Afghanistan, but as an Iranian woman, really sharing that the racism they face in Iran, the discrimination they face in Iran is utterly unacceptable. That when I talk to Syrians, we have to acknowledge that what the Iranian government has done in Syria, has done in Iraq, is utterly unacceptable. And it is up to people, progressives in those diasporas, to also be unashamedly for calling out injustice when it happens here or there, and calling out imperialism wherever we see it.
Thank you.
One last point, if I may, is my ask for everyone in this audience today is I want us to banish the word foreign policy, right? There is no domestic and foreign policy. Those are terms created by people in power to divide our movements so that they can retain the status quo. What we have is a system of violence-first approaches instead of actually solving problems. We are using violence on college campuses. We are using violence on the border. We are using violence overseas. And when we normalize that violence, so when you allow a global gag order so that this country allows for women overseas to not have a say in their reproductive rights, of course it is going to come back here too. So we have to start talking not about foreign policy and domestic policy, but about violence-first approaches and abolition.
Thank you. Sandy, you wanted to respond. Yes, we're doing okay, but I would like to actually now open it up for questions, if you don't mind. I know we have a lot more to say, but...
Just one last point to what Sara was saying. Echo everything that she said. And this is also kind of my deep frustration with some progressive movement organizations. And I think what I want to do is to actually shift a little bit inwards in terms of reflecting on this moment, what our movement is doing. Are we actually building the power with diaspora community? What kind of power are we talking about? Are we actually providing the much needed resources to cultivate the leadership of, culturally competent and people, diaspora leaders that actually have these internationalist instincts that are embedded in these communities. Because echoing what Sara said, Chinese diaspora in many contexts were seen as this huge inconvenience, right? Like, but the fact is that, this presents to be a huge challenge to, let's face it, a still very much white-dominated progressive internationalist space when we actually don't have the competency, have the resources to, cultivate these leadership. And, what the cost is these other right-wing orgs swoop in and, there are so many cases in the Bay Area where Chinese migrants or Chinese immigrants first arrive. You know who welcome them? Evangelical churches. So, if our movement is not doing our thing, if we're not doing our job to actually support the communities and put resources to, cultivate the leadership that grow out of the communities, it's inevitably that we're gonna lead to, what we've seen in case of Chinese communities, the rise of Chinese right wings that have been on many fronts, on domestic issues, have been really causing the undoing of affirmative action, have been on the forefront of, spreading the disinformation about affirmative action, about critical race theory, and so on. And also, let's face it, is implicit in anti-Blackness in this country. So yeah, I know there are a lot of movement strategists and leaders and also funders in this room. So I commend you to put more resources into the diaspora communities, because don't reinvent the wheel. Let's just face it, because these communities already on the forefront of providing services, care to immigrant communities that are impacted by all these issues that we're talking about. So do that, build up the infrastructure that's help us to organize and build power. Yeah.
Thank you, all of you. I'm going to open the floor up for questions. I see a hand right there, and then I see a hand back there. So what I'm going to do, and one right here, I'm going to take maybe 4 questions, and then I'm going to have you all think about how you want to respond so that we can actually hear voices from the audience. Please go ahead. Would you please stand up, say your name, where you're from, if that's that would be helpful, so we're also in community. Mic coming to you.
Hi, I'm Katrina Canyon. I'm the Executive Director of Peace Economy Project. This is my first year here. I came on scholarship, so I really appreciate that. I wouldn't be able to make it otherwise. And I'm standing here as a product of a 400-year diaspora. We have struggles that have gone on for millennia. We built communities after slavery. Those were burned down. And I have constantly been pushing the concept that African-American issues are international issues, that we are part of the diaspora. And what I want to know is 2 questions. How can we, as an African-American community, integrate into the international community with international issues, and also have that question come back? How can the international community reach out to the African-American community, become part of this conversation? And not to call out this panel, but there are no African-Americans sitting on this panel right now.
Absolutely.
They're not talking, there's no discussion about the African-American diaspora that is happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Super important points raised. There was a question in the back.
Hi, I'm Cinda Collins-Arsenault, founder of Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. And so my question for the panelists is how can we utilize the Women, Peace, and Security agenda? We have a resolution at the UN, 1325. We have a law here in the US, the WPS Act of 2017. And what this agenda does is redefine security, recognizing that women see it much broader. It's not just how many arms you have, but economic, healthcare, all of that thing. And it also redefines how our policy is made, that people impacted by policy should be a part of making it. And that currently it's mostly our law focuses outward, but we need to also claim it for our own country.
Thank you. Question up here. Could you bring the mic up here to the front, please? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Faith Gay. I really appreciate the acknowledgement of sort of this tension that sometimes exists in minority communities and diaspora communities in the US in sort of terms of fighting for space and maybe wanting to fit in and assimilation and all those things, and how that often is rooted in an anti-Blackness and sort of a real opposition towards recognizing, you know, the Black and Native people who you know, have suffered under US imperialism. And I also simultaneously I'm from Los Angeles, a place that is home to the largest diaspora communities in the world for a lot of people in the US. And I grew up in a place where we had a lot of Korean people coming, we had a lot of Iranians coming to the US. My family are third generation Black Angelenos, and so they've witnessed this evolution of the city and how much these communities have to live together, right? Like there is nowhere else to go. And so I guess my question, and something I want to hold space for, is a lot of people, our diaspora communities, come to the US they're coming from war, they're coming from occupation, they're coming from bombing, and they're coming from places where they've been exploited, and maybe they think the US is the place where they won't get exploited. And how are we working to like heal the trauma that people have been through? And what are ways that you all work on healing that trauma? Because I think it's not enough to just say that, you know, our communities need to be better about anti-Blackness or about not being in competition with one another. We also have to heal the things that make us feel like we're competing in the first place, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting that. I think many of us understand that that trauma does need to be healed, but I think we haven't actually put that out and actually understood how it then, I mean, we're seeing it kind of played out in live motion right now. If unhealed trauma does not end up being addressed, it creates even more trauma for other people down the road. So I had one more question that was back here. These were the three? There's a question from the Zoom that I want to read out then, and then I'm going to turn it over to you folks. What differences do you see, if any, between military and economic sanctions in terms of how, you know, what can be effective or pressure points or places where you can make a difference? And I would encourage us, since we have about 15 minutes, if you folks would like to do a first round of responses to some of these, or if there were thoughts that you didn't finish in our earlier conversations, to come back to them. But then I'd like to take, if we can, one more set of questions. So who would like to start? Do you remember? Okay, so the first set of questions was the oldest diaspora in this country is actually the Black diaspora who did not come here of their own will. And is there a way in which we think about that, including how we think about representation on panels such as this, in efforts such as this, as we build that kind of sense of awareness and integration so that we don't actually separate out who is a diaspora and who is not. So very short summary, but I hope that was okay. Cinder talked about the what opportunities might there be with the existing women, peace, and security frameworks to be able to have impact, to bring a truly more intersectional feminist lens to that work. How does that fit with some of what you were saying, for example, like we should throw the whole thing out? How do we do that? Where are the spaces of intervention? The question here from our colleague in the front is really about, in the local spaces where we get to act out and play out the experience of people who have been long-standing diasporas still living in this country, then meeting new diasporas who come with their own stress and trauma and histories. What role are we being able to play in recognizing, supporting, and sustaining those kinds of relationship buildings, because I think that can also probably make some difference in terms of how we deal with the past. But the question was also, what experience have you had, or what suggestions might you have for dealing with that kind of trauma? And the last one was about sanctions, which I won't reread. I think you guys got that. Okay.
I think something
Lara.
that's coming up for me in these questions and some of the comments that were just recently made is this just question of power and organizing. Both as it relates to like the contradiction of our own diasporic communities, right? They're not going to naturally be leftists. And by just us being leftists and having that analysis, by not doing the brunt work of actually moving our communities, that's not going to just happen. So, I feel privileged as coming from the Palestinian left tradition, which is very much shaped by and informed by the Black radical tradition, where our political prisoners read Angela Davis, and it was banned in the prisons. My mentors worked against apartheid South Africa and against the coups in Chile, and across Central America. Like, that is who shaped my politics. It doesn't mean that's who shapes everybody's politics. And it also, I know as a Palestinian leftist, when we call to defund Israel, we're emboldening calls to defund the police, abolish prisons, defeat fascism. But does my community know that? And so the work has to be done for us to translate what's happening with the priorities, like the economic priorities of this country, where that's aiding Israel, and then defunding and deprioritizing local communities and material needs. And if we can start to make those connections, that's where this consciousness gets raised. It doesn't just happen, right? And so I think it's in practice, it's in organizing, and it's in movement building. And we got to think about, how are we covering those bases? How are we building up leadership, and whose leadership are we building up? How are we thinking strategically, and who are we using to inform those strategies? And how are we building movement, and who are we building movement with? And to the question of Black leadership, who are we centering in the movements that we are building, right? Because it's not enough to say here, I am informed by Black radical tradition. Am I in community? Are we building with them? Unfortunately, I am, but that's where we have to do the work across movements to ensure this isn't just a question of individual tendencies or knowledge or consciousness. It's about our community understanding the history that we come out of and what we're moving towards. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Thank you, Lara. Others?
I think to the first question, one person I want to shout out is Jasmine Owen, who just did a lot of work on like writing reports about the history of Black leadership in the peace movement, and particularly in the movement for nuclear abolition. And there is such a strong history there of that shared analysis around Black leadership and that internationalist lens, and how that relates to everything, like to your point, has been such a foundation that so many of us have built on. And for me, like to what you were saying again, we have to continue telling those stories and learning from them in each stages of our lives, because they are so systematically erased from the narrative consistently. So I think that's one thing to remember. And like, yes, to do better in terms of making sure those voices are in all of those spaces, are being highlighted. And I really appreciate that call in as well. On the point around care, another group I want to really highlight is Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, who have been out there, who have been out there in their communities, making sure folks are feeling welcome and doing that work in terms of the welcoming with the political education that comes with it. And in some of the hardest times imaginable, and that leadership has always left me so humbled. But if anyone's looking for a model of who does this well, look no further than Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. To the point about like, how can we use the infrastructure we have already to further this work? I think there's so much work in terms of de-siloing some of that, so that we all understand what infrastructure there is, and that as activists, we can push for it in terms of enacting it, enforcing it. And I know I have a lot to learn from that community, and we would really appreciate learning more from it so that we can incorporate it into our activism calls, because I think that's part of, again, that community building, so that when we're building that infrastructure, we can then utilize it and enforce it and make sure that we're making it real every day too.
Christine, and I may have overestimated how much time we have, so I think you might have to finish, and then we'll be pretty much at 10:45. So sorry, folks.
I mean, I don't really have much to add, thankfully, because of my brilliant sisters here. But I guess I really was touched, Faith, by your question. And I think we haven't done enough to address the kind of generational trauma that we all carry as diaspora into this country, and how that affects the way that we are able to be healed ourselves, but also to do the work collectively together. But I guess where I sit in this moment is this is such a beautiful gathering, and there's not enough of these spaces of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational. And actually, like Lara, my teachers are many of the feminist internationalists that have taught me and my generation. I mean, I think of Linda Burnham, Margot Gozal-Ray. I mean, you know, my generation is a product of ethnic studies that didn't exist, of gender studies that didn't exist. And we now have generations of this. And now I look in the room, I see you, Ra, I see Iris, I see Kathy, I see this next generation of even more wiser, sharper, sophisticated, savvy feminists that are taking this work on liberation for Korea, liberation for Palestine to the next level. And so actually, I'm sitting with hope that we are continuing to evolve. We are continuing to build power. We don't have enough power now, but I think we are on the cusp of something really, truly transformative.
Thank you. Sandy, you get the last word. First word and last word.
Just really quickly.
You can leave that down.
Oh.
They can, it's good. It's all good.
Well, I speak at a
know.
very high register, so
I
that's
know.
good to
No,
know.
you're really good.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So just to really want to echo what's been said in terms of centering Black leadership, as well as, you know, understanding the lineage that we come from. You know, the fact that a lot of the progressive internationalist wins that we witnessed in the past century made possible by African diasporas, you know, in terms of, you know, in the 80s and in the 70s, they are at the forefront of supporting these efforts of, you know, anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So yeah, I feel like centering those stories, understanding the lineage is hugely important to me. And kind of if I understand you correctly, there's also a question about opportunities at this moment. What I find it to be hugely encouraged in my line of work is the rising concept, or the rising sort of this cohesive identity around a global South countries. And this is truly remarkable, because this really gives me a lot of courage in terms of thinking about my identity, diaspora identity, not as a dichotomy that really, you know, default backs to the fault lines of US-China great power conflict. And, you know, countries in Africa and in Latin America, people are saying, you know, like, there is an active non-aligned option right now, and we need to consider them. And you know what? Global South as a concept is deeply facing huge backlashes at this moment in Washington, D.C., because U.S. foreign policy are deeply scared that there is this non-aligned, cohesive bloc that is going to play very much a wild card in the US-China great power conflict. So that, to me, is hugely encouraging to see people say that, you know, we don't really want to choose sides. We have our own idea of how to run this world. So that is one point that I would make. And the last point that I want to make is about the sort of the sort of the value of feminist peace framework, to me, is also relies on, a lot of our work really has been sort of depend on making change at the cultural and narrative level. And I think this is the value that feminist peace framework brings in is to take very seriously about people's emotions, identity, and stories. Because, like I said, to revert to some of the trend that really gives rise to the authoritarianism, we have to take very seriously people's fear, anxieties about economic long-term dysfunctions. One way to do that is at the policy level, we have to pass these popular economic agenda. But at the deeper level, we have to figure out a better way to connect with people, to hear their story, to understand their struggle, to better help them to understand how we come to this point. So I think that this is sort of in terms of getting really serious about, identities, emotions, really providing alternative and providing option for people that is grounded in these values in terms of collective care, solidarity, as well as interdependence, is the value of feminist peace framework today. Yeah.
Thank you. I had this question, about like what gives you hope, but I think you actually just heard from 4 people and from yourselves, with really important questions from the audience, that there is really a lot of hope. There's also a hell of a lot of work to be done. But I am so grateful to the 4 of you for sharing your perspectives. I am really hoping that we get to do this work we have no choice but to do this work right now. There is no time. And I just want to say, as somebody who grew up in a different era, where we actually had a non-aligned movement, a global non-aligned movement, and in which my passport was stamped not valid for the Republic of South Africa and the State of Israel on the basis of apartheid. That was the India of the 1960s and the 1970s and the early 80s. So there is hope for a new global South-led, and the South that exists inside the global North is called diaspora. So thank you all. Thank you guys. Give it up. Woo!